Well, welcome. Thanks for sharing your evening with us today. Um, your microphones are muted, but you're more than welcome to ask us in the chat box. Feel free to post your questions, or you can use the raise your hand um, Q&A feature, whatever is turned on and working, hopefully. My name is Trey, and tonight we're doing the Obituaries, Society columns, and news. Hopefully tonight you'll learn how to locate and use newspapers to find something interesting about your family, or maybe fill in some blanks of some things that you didn't know about your family. We'll also cover the high points of what you can find at the library's Genealogy Center. So thanks for joining us. Let's get started. So tonight we're going to provide introduction to what's available in newspapers. And hopefully we'll be able to provide you with some various skills and provide some basic tips on how to research newspaper resources, identify where to find newspapers, and discover can't talk discover various online resources to find newspapers. And I'll try not to get in a tongue twister and trip over my own words. So some basic research tips. So what might be available in newspapers? I think a lot of people, most people may be familiar that you sometimes are able to find birth announcements, maybe marriage and divorce announcements, or um, legals, what was called legals. There may be some legal filings. Might find some obituaries, some death notices, other court announcements. And like I had mentioned, the legals, you have the um, local government or county government that runs, or in the past was when newspapers were the dominant form of communication media. They had the job of running the legal uh, information for a government entity. You might find information about someone may have celebrated a birthday, maybe anniversaries. You might find something in social columns. You may find something um, in advertisements. Definitely might find something with school events. And depending on where in the country, you may find information on uh, ship arrivals and departures if it was a newspaper covering a city or an area with ports. And general local news and history are also widely available. Now, it's good to note that sometimes newspapers may disappear and they go completely out of business. So, especially consider if some of the information you're looking for is during a time of war or disease, pandemics, like the most recent COVID-19, I dare say. Um, a good example is Plano Star Courier didn't publish for a number of weeks during the lockdowns for COVID-19. And then they were only published on some Sundays, and that was due to the office buildings being closed during the lockdown. So that's a more recent historic example, and there have been others. So here's a question I'm going to pose to y'all, and you can use the raise your hand feature. But my question is, have you personally ever been mentioned in a newspaper? Uh, or do you even know if you've been mentioned in a newspaper? So give you a moment to think about that. Raise your hand and okay. A couple of you have been mentioned in a newspaper. You might be surprised. Many more of you may have been mentioned in a newspaper and that just didn't know that you were in kindergarten and something got published. Bet your parents might have known. They might have kept a clipping, perhaps. So you never know what you're going to find. It's a lot of times it's typically, I would say it's harder to find small town newspapers, if they even existed for a community. But sometimes those stories from those papers can be picked up through one of the wire services like Associated Press News or other wire services back in the day, and be run in other newspapers around the state or even across a region, multi-states, or around the whole country, depending on how interesting and newsworthy it may have been or how spectacular it may have been. Um, a lot of times use an example I stumbled across um, where my grandfather was an eyewitness to a post World War II or immediately post war. I forget exactly when, late 40s or early 50s. He was eyewitness to an aircraft exploded in midair, and the article was from a small local paper in one end of the state on it's a community that straddles Louisiana and Arkansas, so one of the little small border towns, and it got picked up and run in the Baton Rouge newspaper. So I stumbled across it researching and looking up for, I forget why I was even looking in Baton Rouge newspapers, one of those weird little rabbit hole adventures. And I stumbled across this, seeing um, what family names appeared, and lo and behold, so you never know. You may focus your search kind of tight for a community that you just keep coming up with nothing. So sometimes you may want to widen that search a little bit, because it might get picked up and run in a neighboring community newspaper. Very possible. Um, One of my colleagues had her mother's sister's death was reported in the Detroit Free Press, but the incident had actually occurred in, oh, how do you pronounce that? Mus Muskegon? Muskegon, thank you, where her mother's family lived. So just because someone lived in an area, if a large chunk of the family may live in another area, or they had maybe no longer live in that area, but had friends and some family in a different community, it's possible they also ran an obituary or a death notice in some other location other than just right in your community where they're from. So how to research? Well, it really depends on what do you want to find, or who, where, and when. Um, so there are a few basic questions you can ask before you start. Um, it's really good to gather your notes and decide what do you want to find, the who, the what, the where, the when. Determine what newspapers could help you discover, what possible family information you're looking for. It's like I had mentioned just a little while ago. It was there newspapers in the community you're researching where you think they lived or you needed to find the information. Um, those newspapers come and go. And sometimes in early community history, there was a lot of times there was multiple newspapers, surprisingly, in the smallest, tiniest farming communities. They may have once supported three or four newspapers. Um, but depending on the period of time you're looking for, they may have had no newspapers before a newspaper started again in the community, maybe 20 or 30 years after the last one closed. You just kind of got to look at the history of the community and see if you can find that information. Um, and consider, where do you find the newspapers? And we'll talk about that in a few moments. So searching the newspapers, when you start your research, look through the newspaper resources. Just do not forget to cite your sources, because you want to be able to find that again. So you set aside your research and get sidetracked and don't pick it up for another couple of weeks, couple of months, dare I say a couple of years. And you want to be able to retrace your steps and find that source again, because you might realize, oh, wait a minute, I forgot to write down all my information. So Please remember to make notes of the publication title, the volume, the issue number, and the date of publication, and of course the page numbers. Once you've done your research, kind of evaluate and reflect on a few things. Ask yourself two very important questions. How did this help me? And where do I go from here? Those are two important questions to ask. And don't forget that newspapers can be primary and secondary sources of information. You've got to critically evaluate each article to determine whether it's a primary or a secondary source. So generally, newspapers are a great source of primary historical information about a community and how it was written about at the time events were happening or shortly afterwards. So identifying and finding newspapers. So one of the first steps in finding newspapers is to identify what publications existed for a given time period, as I've already mentioned. And you shouldn't be surprised that over the decades, communities large and small may have had several newspapers. And you just have to find out what was covered. A lot of times they merged. You may find a lead on a particular newspaper name to not finding that record after a certain period of time, and it very well could be that it merged, was absorbed, bought out, and merged with another newspaper or another entity that changed it to something completely different, new name. Um, Most of the time, you'll find newspapers were either a weekly or a daily publication. There were others, sometimes there was other variations of that, but you had weekly newspapers or you had daily newspapers. They either published in the morning or they published in the afternoon or evening newspapers. And I'll say this, that historically, afternoon and evening newspapers were the least likely to survive in business. Because if you think about it, by the end of the day, the afternoon or evening, um, that's not typically a time people sit down with their morning coffee, if you get my drift, to see what was happening in it and read the newspaper. It was kind of traditionally the morning, the fresh news of the day that stayed in popular demand. And a lot of times the evening and afternoon papers were the first ones to close in a community. As an example of name changes through periods, let's have an example of the Plano Star Courier. So Plano Star Courier had a number of different variations of names. So from 1902 to 1908, it was the Star Courier. Then from 1908 to sometime in the 1900s, it was the Plano Star Courier. And then from whatever that time period in the 1900s to 1986, it was the Plano Daily Star Courier. And then from 86 to current, well, this has now changed from 86 to 2022. It was the Plano Star Courier. And now it is, and I have to look at an example, from 2025 to future, it is now called Star Local News. So they've completely rebranded the parent company. So it's essentially the same entity. It just has different name changes. So you may keep that in in mind when you're looking through the records, because they'll be pointing to one of those historic names at a point, if that makes sense. So finding the newspapers. So you're looking at obviously starting where the town where a person lived, town or city. You can broaden your search and look at neighboring towns and cities. And sometimes there's newspapers that cover an entire county or a whole region of counties, more regional papers. So you can kind of look at those to see what coverage might be included. Also, don't discount where towns where relatives live. As I mentioned with the obituaries, a lot of times Those obituaries run in more than just one newspaper, wherever there was a big concentration of relatives or community that would remember an individual. Maybe it was a well-known, well-loved principal for the small school, but no longer living in the community. An obit might run there where they had served so long in the schools, as an just as an example. So, kind of an example, if you're researching Plano, you of course got the Plano Star Courier, or now the what I just say, the yeah, Star Local. Look, yeah, I need to write that down. I can't remember it yet. You also have local magazines or redistribution newspapers like Community Impact. Um, that's also available that you might have some information. And then our neighboring community, you have the McKinney Courier Gazette. In Frisco, you have the Frisco Enterprise, the Allen American. Now, these are all Star local media titles, and I haven't read the full announcement on what the rebranding for the Plano Star Courier entails. As I understand from one component that I heard, it's rebranding for a larger regional type paper. So I don't know if they will retain um, individualized McKinney, Frisco, Allen. That I haven't read. So don't quote me on that. We'll have to figure that out when everything, all the cards fall on the floor. We'll figure that out. But as far as a county or a region, the Dallas Morning News is, covers a wide range of our area, and this type is more typical of rural areas. You'll sometimes have a large newspaper. They'll cover multi counties over. Some counties or parishes, if you're from Louisiana, may not have a local newspaper, so you'll have something like if you're, you know, trying to remember offhand a name, the Shreveport Times. If you're in that section of Louisiana, um, that covers a wider region, you might find information there. A lot harder to find the granular, fine, um, real local news in a newspaper like that. You might also have different ethnic communities within the region that might have their own newspapers. An example would be the North Dallas Gazette. Um, that's an African American newspaper covering North Dallas. And you also have or had, I'm not sure if that's still in publication or not, but there was examples of the Dallas Chinese News. So you have um, communities within communities that might have their own publications serving their community needs and informational um, distribution. So consider that. And some might be in foreign language. So you have the Dallas Morning News has the Spanish language, the Al Dia, and there may be some other papers for other languages that may exist within a larger community such as ours. It's very diverse. And then you, of course, might have religious institutions that might put out a newspaper. So they're something a little bit broader, and maybe church newsletters. They may do a almost newspaper-like tabloid newsletter that kind of stands in the place of a traditional newspaper. May not have advertising per se, but um, it's published on a regular basis. College and universities frequently have newspapers covering college information. So you have the uh, NT North Texas Daily, the UNT newspaper, or UTD Mercury, or University of Texas at Dallas. So you've got a variety of places that you might can find some information. So identifying and finding newspapers. Unfortunately, not everything is online. Um, that's the challenge. That's the big challenge. Um, and the biggest thing to remember, unfortunately, is just not every issue of every possible newspaper is available online or has been collected or exists. Just like you may have already found out doing other genealogy research, trying to find courthouse records only to find out that a courthouse from such and such county burned in 1922 or 1912 or it's same kind of things. A lot of times those downtown city fires that took out entire city blocks, like the Plano fire, also took out the newspapers. Frisco had a fire that wiped out the downtown that also happened to wipe out the newspaper. So all those back copies they may have stored or had on hand, they disappeared to history. But do check with your local libraries to see what newspapers are available. We, we speaking of us, we try to collect as many as we can of our local newspaper. And we just wish there was a one-stop shop for newspapers uh, that had exactly the publications we needed, that covers the dates we needed, and represents complete collections. That's the other thing. Even if something is covered, there's frequently there's gaps because for some reason the dog ate the newspaper before someone was able to collect it off the porch of the library or wherever, the museum that might keep it. Who knows? Um, wish there was a great place to go. Yeah, this is it, but it doesn't, unfortunately. But if failing, check with your local libraries, check your nearby areas. Sometimes with exchange programs, um, newspapers would exchange um, copies, subscriptions with other competitors around the area. So sometimes something might survive in another town because it just so happened to be collected and sent as a courtesy copy to a nearby newspaper or community. And don't stick exactly to the date you have. Think forward and backwards in time. It's not a perfect game, and sometimes publication dates on the newspaper are done incorrectly. Believe it or not, that does happen. I have been guilty of that myself. I come from a newspaper background. Our newspaper had been in our family for 90 something years before we sold. Um, and sometimes you grab the wrong date thinking it was the current date and you goof and you publish the wrong, you repeat a volume number. Oh, it's a cardinal sin, but it happens. And it has happened to everybody. If you look back at, as you're going through and some of the volume numbers look out of sync and the dates are in order, something like that has probably happened. And they've either reused a volume number and then continued on and never fixed it, or it could be a newspaper changed hands, changed ownership. And for whatever reason, they repeated a volume number or started over with a completely different volume number. It happens. But by all means, cite your article sources. So we have a lot of materials to go through. I'm going to pause here to see if there were any questions or anything I could help with.
We did have one question about whether there were lists, reference books that listed U.S. newspapers and showing the history of the papers. And I mentioned that you would be covering that probably in this next session.
Yep. And again, it yeah, yes, no, maybe. That's the best answer. Something may exist, and many times, unfortunately, what you're looking for doesn't exist. It depends on the state. It depends on the history of the state, and particularly hmm, how should I say, how robust the state's press association, um, and how early a particular state's press association may have evolved or come into existence for newspapers. Um, Frequently, you can find some history of the state's newspapers through the press association or newspaper association or some variation of name, um, like that. But it may not be complete because not all newspapers were members of said organization, so they might not appear in those publications because they're not members. Um, it Unfortunate but true. But there are a lot of resources. Even with all of these resources, you still might not find what you're looking for because a lot of things, if they exist, if someone digitized them, so that's two things going for them. They exist and someone digitized them. They may not be publicly accessible because of digital rights, copyright, or access rights. A Yeah, I'll talk about that in a moment when we get into some of these projects here. I'll just save that for a minute. Um, so there are a lot of free things, sure. We'll go through each of these in turn, and there are a few paid things. There's some really good paid things, but you know, they're fee based, and that's all I'm going to say about that. But we'll talk about each of these in turn here. Kind of partially answers the question about is there one a location or something with a list. This is kind of one of those, yes, kind of. So the Library of Congress has a really great resource chronicling America. So this is a collaboration of the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Library of Congress. And it's a long-term effort to provide a searchable database on the web to access information about historic newspapers. So it provides select digitized newspaper pages that are produced by the National Digital Newspaper Program. A lot of acronyms: NEH, LOC, NDNP, typical of a lot of institutions, but it has a newspaper title directory, and it can be a good, useful place to start. The Library of Congress considers the chronicling American newspapers to be in the public domain. So all of these in the Library of Congress should be, if they've digitized them and they list them, they should be accessible for search and review. And I can't remember if I have a, nope, I couldn't remember if I had a pop up that came up after that with a something zoomed in that you could see a little better. But this has historic newspapers from 1789 through 1963. Now, just like I had mentioned, it's not going to be a complete set for some of these papers, but it at least gives you a wide spectrum of things you might be able to find. So WorldCat, some of you may have used WorldCat previously on when the state had the interlibrary, use WorldCat for the interlibrary loan. Um, it still exists, um, even though Texas doesn't use it for the interlibrary loan system. You can still search Texas or worldwide. It's useful for finding newspapers that are held by public or academic libraries. So if you're having trouble, if you find the name, you can kind of go, okay, who might have a repository or have these in a collection? You can still use WorldCat to at least explore and research. The current interlibrary loan system that we use, that Texas use, is Share It. Um, this is still, I think, last I had heard, is still having public libraries and I think academic libraries maybe adding their catalogs slowly to the system. So it's still building. It's still relatively small, but it's still catalog and the access to viewing collections is still building. But it still um, gives you the opportunity to search Texas libraries, see what they hold, and it can be useful in finding newspaper holdings. I've played around with it a little bit. Some of my searches were not great, but I just played with it briefly. But it is possible you can search with for newspapers through Share It. And if you find a new library that holds a newspaper that you're interested in locating, please talk with us at the Genealogy Center, and we can find out about interlibrary loan might be possible for microfilm or copies of the microfilm that's held in other institutions. Um, we encourage you, please email us your questions so we can kind of do some back end research to see what we might have access to. You can email us at genealogy@plano.gov, or you can also, of course, go directly to our genealogy interlibrary loan form online. So for our, and I just realized I haven't updated this slide. Oops. Our genealogy center does have some resources. We do have some microfilm of local newspapers. We do have the Plano Star Courier, and we do have um, the McKinney, some of the McKinney papers and some of the Dallas newspapers on microfilm. We do have access to the Dallas Morning News Historical Archive. That's one of the online resources. That's going to be grand for researching some things. It doesn't give you, um, it's searchable. It'll come up with a text, but you're not going to see, it's not the digitized um, image of the article as it was printed. It's going to be digital text. It's going to give you the text of the article, but not the actual. But at least that's something that can narrow down what you're looking for. And then if you want to actually see it as it appeared in the paper, then you might can we'll have to try some other avenues. For the Plano Star Courier, our earliest microfilm through, oh, Bethany, what was the date? I always forget the yeah, for the date for the microfilm. I forgot. It's sometime in the 80s was our cutoff from the earliest early 1900s through the sometime in the 1980s. Sorry, I forgot. We have a we got a grant to digitize, and that is off being digitized. And when that is done, which should be completed any month now, uh, those early Plano Star Couriers that are currently on microfilm with no index, nothing except rolls of film that you have to go through, will be hosted on the portal to Texas history, um, and will be keyword searchable and will be marvelous. So um, that's something to look forward to if you're researching earlier Plano Star Courier. And if you happen to come in looking for those, that's why they're not in the catalog currently, and that's not why they're not on the shelf, because they're off being digitized. So apologies, but please be patient. Something great is coming, and we'll get those back. And so we'll still have the physical microfilm, but the digitized copies will be online and searchable, which is awesome. And then we also have a link to the McKinney Public Library's newspaper of birth, engagement, marriage, obituary resources, which is another good resource. Oh, here's part of it. We had I'm sorry, I had my notes here. So online resources, the name index we had from 1918 to 1923. And then we have the historical issues of the Dallas Morning News via the News Bank. Yeah. All right. Another free resource available through the library is the Ancestry Library Edition. There are individual membership subscriptions if you were to go out into the wild and do that, but the Ancestry Library Edition is free with access with your library card in the library. This is a for-profit company. It's owned by an investor group, and it's not affiliated with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, even though it just so happens to be based in Utah. But it has a collection of newspapers, both U.S. and international, and it's a good resource for that. And you can see the search looks a lot like some of the rest of the search features on their website. And you've got, yeah, a bunch of different things. So they're constantly digitizing more and more stuff. Fold 3, you can access this one from home with your library card. It's a product of Ancestry. And it has digital collections that include historic newspapers from the 1700s through the 1900s, and it's keyword searchable. So it's not just always just about the military records. It's got some historic newspapers as well. So the digital collection began in 1999 as part of iArchive, and it later became footnote.com in 2007. And then it was rebranded to Fold 3 in 2011 before it was purchased by Ancestry in 2010. So it's a long history. But they've got a pretty good collection of that to explore. Oh, yeah, there we go. So you might find some interesting things. Not database is not specifically newspaper set, but it does have some newspapers. So while the Texas State Genealogical Society doesn't appear to have a collection of newspaper resources, I listed it here um, just as an illustration of a larger organization in the state, just as a reference that many other states may have something similar that may have a newspaper archive collection or something, some program. Um, the Texas State Genealogical Society does offer programs that include subjects like finding newspapers online. I just didn't want to lead off with the Oklahoma Historical Society, which does have a newspaper archive. They've got a really cool um, collection that they've been working on that is has their collection hosted on the called the Gateway to Oklahoma, and it's a site hosted by University of North Texas. Looks very similar to the portal, which we'll talk about shortly. Um, but they have if you have relatives, you're researching anybody from Oklahoma, this is a really cool resource because they have done their utmost, as I understand it, to collect as many historic newspapers um, up to more recent times covering the state of Oklahoma throughout Oklahoma history, which is probably not a small task for any state, but and they've tried to make it available through the Gateway to Oklahoma. But the point is, there's many such national, regional, county, or local organizations scattered throughout the U.S. that may offer something similar. So explore some of those sites. If you get stuck, they might yield some clues. As I already mentioned, the Portal to Texas History. This is hosted by the University of North Texas, and they have Texas Digital Newspaper Program, and they partner with communities, institutions, and publishers around the state. And they're working to make Texas newspapers freely accessible online, and they're fully word searchable. And as I said, if you go to the Gateway to Oklahoma history or this, it looks similar. It's because it's hosted by the University of North Texas. So a similar platform and a really cool resource. So Portal, Texas history has a lot of newspapers in it. Um, Never know what you're going to find because they're always adding to it. They've been working on this. Oof, they have probably been working on this project for over 10 years now, probably. I'm trying to remember back to last when I first talked to them about some of this, and it's been a while. So yeah, at least 10 years or more. They've been working on this. US GenWeb is another possibility. Um, it's a free volunteer-run database or collection of resources. It's free access, and it collects resources from historical genealogical societies, groups, or individuals from around the U.S. And you might be able to discover the names of other publications that existed in different periods of history. Um, Again, since it's volunteer run, it really depends on the activities of individuals or groups in a particular county, in a particular state, of what kind of materials they have. Just as an example, um, for Lincoln Parish in Louisiana, they actually did a list of Lincoln Parish and surrounding areas, and they listed out some newspapers, dailies and weeklies, and they at least give them a little comment. So where you might be able to find some of these microfilms of some of these newspapers. And it was a lot of interesting things. I was in the industry and I didn't know about some of these papers in history. I'm sad to say. So it was kind of cool to see some of these, like, oh, look at that. Didn't know that. So your mileage may vary. Like I said, it depends on the county and the state, but you might find some resource list. So leave no stone unturned. Family Search. This is a nonprofit family history center. It's free access. This is a service provided by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Um, and they have collections, historical record collections, um, according to their site, from 655 AD until today. And there's over 4 billion names from worldwide. You can do name searches. Of course, that includes records as well as newspapers. But you'll be able to search their catalog for items. You never know what you might find, but it's a pretty broad database. And I'll mention here, since we already mentioned Ancestry Library Edition, it may seem similar, and they are, but they're not. It's really helpful to search both because there are about 90% unique records that doesn't overlap. They may only overlap 10% of the records, and those are probably census records. So they have unique collections of information, 90% difference between Family Search and Ancestry Library Edition. So I know some people have said, "Oh, I only like this or that one." You're limiting yourself by not using both because you really need to use both to get the um, full search. Then you have something like the Briscoe Center for American History, or I guess the full name, the Dolph Briscoe Center for American History, is at the University of Texas at Austin. And this is the largest newspaper collection of its kind in Texas. It has over 4,500 titles from covering Texas, the South, U.S., and some non-U.S. newspapers. It's home to newspaper clipping morgues of the New York Herald Tribune, the New York Journal American, the New York Times, and Newsweek magazine. And they have specialty collections like the um, Natchez Trace collection newspaper, sorry, but it's not digitized. At least it wasn't the last time I checked. And the Gannett newspaper collection also has not been digitized. It's a collection of newspapers, both U.S. and non-U.S., covering significant events that were collected. Other newspapers that the Gannett newspapers collected, like I mentioned, kind of maybe like the exchange papers. I will say that this site I have found not to be easy to navigate and search online for. Um, I would say this is more of an advanced resource requiring a possible visit to the center to access some of this material. They don't appear to have a lot of it digitized and online. Okay, so Genealogy Bank, this one also has a subscription required. They have newspapers covering 1690 through today. It's over 13,000 big city and small town newspapers. And about 95% of the newspapers they say are exclusive to Genealogy Bank. Um, so they do have Dallas Morning News. We have. Um, they supposedly have newspapers from all 50 states. And I will note too, um, I'll save that to the end. I'll try to remember. I was going to comment something about the difference between the big city newspapers and the small town newspapers, but I may be getting ahead of myself. Yeah, and if you Genealogy Bank, when I did this screenshot, had a list of 662 newspapers in Texas from different times in antiquity. As you can see, they have the Abilene Reporter News, and they've got coverage from 1910 through 2018. I don't know the history. Presumably, they stopped publication in 2018, or they merged with something else, or that's all the physical collections they have. And it may have continued post 2018. It may be online only. That's another kind of little tidbit of information you'd need to look at to see. Just because it has coverage up to a certain date doesn't necessarily mean it went out of business. Especially nowadays, it may have become digital online only publication possible. So they didn't have a um, physical publication to digitize. Probably more frequent in news magazines than the newspapers. Another ancestry product is newspapers, also a subscription based service that claims to be the largest online newspaper archive with 16,700 plus newspapers from the 1700s to the 2000s, and millions of pages they claim are added each month. So it's covering 300 plus years of U.S. and world newspapers, both small town and large city newspapers. And the last time I checked, the basic level included clipping and sharing. Advanced subscription provides access to additional 415 million plus pages. So they have tiers. But the pages scans are OCR images, so they allow searching for text. So you can do name searches.
Trey,
Uh-huh.
someone commented that newspapers.com periodically has free access weekends.
Yep. Yep. Forgot to mention a lot of these actually probably have free trial. So you never know, you might get lucky. So yes, that is something to look for. Thank you for reminding. And You can browse without a subscription and at least see if something is covered. You won't be able, as memory serves, you won't be able to click on the digitized image to open it up without a subscription. But at least you can see if it has the newspaper or the time period you're interested in to see if it's worth your time. And as you can see, at least in this particular, that if you're from Shiner and you're looking at the Shiner Gazette in Texas, it looks like in May, they only have 3 copies of 1894 May issues, if you're interested. Newspaper Archive is another that's subscription based. They have newspapers from 1607 to present. They list 108 million plus obituaries with over 9 million names, and they list 15,831 plus current and historic newspapers. And the collection covers all 50 states and 32 international countries. Started to say companies, 32 international countries. And as you can see, they just a search for the McKinney Courier Gazette. They have a neat little feature where you can browse by year and have almost like a little bar graph representing the concentration of where their collections are concentrated. So you can see they have a little bit in 1910, but they have really significant coverage in their collection of the late 68 through 69 and most of 1970, and then some gap years before covering some more coverage in 75, 76. All right, we're almost to the end. Trust me. Um, American Ancestors is another interesting resource, and this is by the New England, hosted and produced by the New England Historic Genealogical Society, and that was founded in 1845. It's a paid membership-based nonprofit, so they do have membership structure, fee structure. But the organization provides an impressive range of education, services, and original research in family histories. And they have many special collections, including newspapers, family histories, and photographs. And they offer loads of webinars and subject guides to help promote, genealogical research, the usual thing you would imagine. But it really interesting is that they have a special collection of the 19th century newspaper database. And the last I checked, individual membership provided standard access to the American Ancestries, an online family tree program. It's an odd spelling. I was trying to pronounce and emphasize the trees at the end. And a new one we have to the list, which made this list longer. Sorry about that. But this was a recent discovery. Um, Old News is a new product offering by MyHeritage, and they launched this not hardly a year ago in March of 2024. And it has, um, well, they launched this subscription-based newspaper archive, and it's very similar to newspapers.com and others, but they do offer a 7-day free access available. And their resource advertises that it provides access to historical newspapers from around the world and millions of pages from thousands of historical newspapers, according to their homepage. I didn't get to access and play with any of this. I didn't have time to start a free trial to take a look, but it sounds interesting. So, are there any questions?
While people are thinking of their questions, I did want to put in some stuff, some dates into the chat.
Oh, perfect.
So I'm going to post some upcoming programs by our partners. Collin County Genealogical Society has a program coming up Wednesday, March 12th here at Haggard Library. And so check that out. And the Genealogy Friends of Plano Libraries has some upcoming programs as well in March and in April. So definitely take a look at those. And then we have two more programs coming up this spring season, presented by the Genealogy Center staff. So I put those in there. And just wanted to remind everyone that there's a lot of information on our website. You can visit the Genealogy Center online. There's a link for it. And that this program is being recorded and will appear some days from now on our YouTube channel, where many of our past webinars are there for you to take a look at whenever you have time. And for those of you who emailed us about getting the handout, we will email that handout back to you in the next day or so. And lastly, just a link to the library's calendar in case you wanted to check out any other programming. And Trey, back to you.
Thank you. Thank you. And I remember that little tidbit. I was going to wait to the end. For a lot of, well, for many, many years, large newspaper aggregators that you can usually typically find through your library's resources or wider available, or typically have only um, indexed larger newspapers. So Dallas Morning News would be indexed because it's more of a large city or a regional newspaper, and lesser so the hyper local, I'm going to call it, um, uh, like the Plano and McKinney newspapers generally. Um, I think over the years, as we're seeing with some of these new resources, like the one old news that came online, and some of these others, especially like the Oklahoma and the UNT's portal to Texas history, there's more of a concerted effort to try to find the small town local newspapers and doing a concerted effort to try to ferret out as many of those as they can, um, from barns wherever wherever they might can be found, archives, museums, libraries, wherever, and trying to get those collected to get public access to those if they exist physically somewhere. Unfortunately, there's so many that are probably long gone to the time.
Trey, wanted to let you know that we do have a couple more questions.
Sure.
Someone asked if there are any resources through some of the other databases available through the Plano Library, our Research and Learn databases, and I believe that person might be asking about genealogy resources. And I think I could direct you to the Genealogy Center webpage.
Yep. Genealogy Center webpage would be a good place to go. And that'll get you into the online resources that we have. Um, Link out to some of our collections. If you're looking local, you have the Collin County images of some of our archive materials. Um, yeah, that would be a good place to start.
Okay, and another question was, a few years ago, I stumbled across Fulton History Search where I did some New York State historical papers. Are you familiar with it? And if so, any tips for searching it more efficiently?
I'm unfortunately not familiar with that resource, so I have no clue. That might be something good to, if you want to give some time to play around with. You're more than welcome to email us at genealogy@plano.gov, kind of give us some parameters of what you were searching, or you can do the Book of Genealogy Librarian, and we can take a look and see if we might could help.
And it looks like that may be all questions answered.
Cool. Well, thank you everyone for sharing your evening with us. Um, if you think of something after the fact that you burning, yearning question that you thought, oh, I should have asked that, feel free, please email us at genealogy@plano.gov and we'll be happy to answer.